Good late Tuesday, early Wednesday, meteorologist Casey Cloud here in Witherspoon right now, giving a look at that Doppler radar perspective across the region with those temperatures at this late hour around 2 a.m. on this Wednesday, really, as we're looking at things. And you do see quite a few 60s on the board. It's pretty nice out there. We've had kind of this interesting pattern here, a little bit of a drier picture than we were anticipating here over the last few days. On Saturday was still pretty wet for folks, but most of our area not seeing as much rain here, rest of that Labor Day weekend. Look at the beaches kind of having some issues there toward the East Coast. But as we were looking at things here, the northeasterly winds here toward the First Coast area made things kind of breezy. It was cloudy at times. It was a little bit cooler, and it's still kind of, staying a little bit cooler out there. So that's something we like to see. I mean, relatively, but it's something where it's just more about the drier air, and during the afternoons we're going to still get pretty warm. Then we're going to start getting warmer and warmer, and we'll have more storms around eventually. But a little bit, longer here with a pattern here that's a little drier. Even if it is still kind of warm during the afternoons, it will be kind of drier here, to some degree as we're looking. I mean, you see 72 there on Keystone, but because of the overall pattern, we're the coolest, we've been here this time of night in a while, I would say. I know last week we did have some cool air coming on in here at points, but we're at 65 right now here east of Stark, so that is some pretty cool air as we're tracking things in my rural area out here. So as we're just kind of looking, you see some 65 type readings here toward the Brunswick area, and you see even cooler air there south of Albany, 64 there on Tifton. So kind of giving you the idea of some of these different readings, up in Bacon County, just north of the viewing area, 63. So yeah, we're starting to get signs that we're getting there. I know, as we're looking at summer, well, not, the way it is kind of getting, closer to being over, but, the unofficial end was Labor Day weekend, but we're not maybe quite there yet. We're going to still have some pretty warm air, some storms still, but you see our general thunderstorm risk on the Wednesday, ahead, going to be staying toward the south in General Levy and, Marion, Putnam, St. John, Southward. You see a little Dixie in there, but you kind of get the idea. I know as we're kind of tracking the different counties there, you see the northeasterly winds. There's some accent toward the coast, possible there, but yeah, there's northeasterly winds, coastal flood advisory out there with that pattern. We've been watching that rip current risk here, kind of a nor'easter type, look at things here as we're watching, as we're tracking, not something just really overwhelming, but definitely, those northeasterly winds here that have been a story, that's what's continuing as we're looking ahead a little bit, as we're tracking things, but continue to stay pretty dry. I know the storms toward Central Florida a little more likely in the days ahead, just south of the viewing area. We'll have to watch, see. I know Bradford's going to be playing in areas there around Bushnell, so they're in Sumter County, so Bushnell, however you want to pronounce that. So again, something, we'll have to watch there for Friday night. Something, it's not quite in our viewing area, so we got to take that into consideration a little bit here too. But, in our local 62 counties, Sumter's not in our 62 there in Central Florida, but as we're looking at things, we see that issue there. We'll have to watch. But as we look, I know, up toward Georgia, or Sumter County area up there, that's not quite our area either. Kind of interesting how that works as we look at things, We do have Leesburg, Georgia in our viewing area, but not Leesburg, Florida. Kind of just, interesting how the geography works with things. But as we're kind of watching the overall pattern here, let me see that rainfall amount total graphic here. You can kind of see some things last 12 hours, not that much really, so that's some good news. I don't want that rain around. Most of you probably a tenth of an inch in a few spots there. The darker green, the lighter green, even a little bit less than that, as you saw on that map. So yeah, it's been, a little bit drier. It's a little bit nicer, been a little nicer in some of our backyards than we were anticipating for the end of that Labor Day weekend. And a lot of that will continue here toward the weekend ahead as we're tracking things. I know, let me pull up the American model, the GFS model here, and we'll go ahead and get into toward that Friday, because I know you guys are always wanting to know about high school football. So this is what 2 o'clock looks like on that Friday. 5 o'clock, 8 o'clock, so not looking too bad overall. I have it angled a little bit further south since Bradford will be playing outside of the coverage area just by a little ways, but don't even see a whole bunch down there. I mean, this is just one model. This model here doesn't go out as far. This model here will, so let me go ahead and progress it. It does show some stuff a little bit more downstate than, even Bushnell. I mean, I'll zoom in here. There's Bushnell, Sumter County. See stuff just south on this. So it's something to watch a little bit more for those folks who just kind of shifts around just a little bit. They could have some issues we south see. But that's for Friday night. I know on Saturday, those big college games. FSU, I mean, I can't believe what they did there against Alabama on Saturday afternoon. My Seminoles there, that's one of the bigger upset wins that I've, probably my lifetime there. I mean, unfathomable that they would win that game and win that game easily, but that's how the transfer portal is, I guess, now. Sometimes you just don't know what's, going to happen as new players come together on a roster. A lot of times you can look at their past results, but sometimes maybe, the quarterback has struggled in the past there. The new quarterback for FSU, Tommy Castellanos there. And he really did well in that game on Saturday. So to see if that continues. Kind of stunning to see that, to be quite honest. In Alabama, they really had problems. They are looking like, as you see lightning currently to the east. I know I zoomed out there, so it's going to confuse you probably, possibly, but you can't see it on the radar. Let me go ahead and put up the model and again take that current lighting off because this model is for Friday evening. This is the American model here again as we're tracking things. Yeah, unbelievable that FSU won that game like they did. And, it's a great thing. That never changed it. Alabama got the nod over them for that playoff spot, though, in late 2023. But, great moment for the FSU community. As we go ahead and look here, though, at 5 p.m. on your Saturday, a few showers, maybe storms. It could be a little bit, heavier in a few spots than this does. On Tallahassee, Gainesville, there's a big game there. USF, I mean, they got that one against Boise State. They'll be coming into Gainesville for the SEC Network game, the FSU games, an early kick on the ACC Network, so it could be a little warm, especially for the FSU game if we don't get the cloud and rain. I know that accent. A lot of the games we got lucky with the weather. FSU's game, well, we did have some rain. It wasn't that bad. We got really lucky. Didn't have no lightning delay, though, so that was a positive there. As we go back to the current temperatures, put that radar and lightning back on here, but, just something that's interesting to think about there. I mean, really, FSU, and of course, we got that terrible news, Sunday night, though, about the FSU football player that was shot there in Ward Gaston County. My thoughts and prayers, definitely going out there, definitely going out to Ethan Pritchard and his family during this difficult time. You hate hearing about stuff like that. That was unrelated, it seems, to anything to do with that football game on Saturday. It was in a different county, in a different day, but I just hate seeing that. But as we're tracking things here, you can kind of see that rainfall off the first coast here. Seeing that moisture, and we'll see if some of that gets on shore now. The tropics are not overly concerned in the water area, but I do want to see something in the Central Pacific. First off, we'll stop in the Eastern Pacific. Some moisture coming in the southwest here. Tropical storm Lorena there. You can kind of see some of that's kind of angling up toward the southwest. And I'll put on some of the other models that show, something a little bit crazier. Not really, maybe tropical by the time it gets across Texas. But that moisture could be something we'll have to watch for out there, depending on how that holds together. I mean, there's a lot of terrain in those regions and the like. But something from the Eastern Pacific could be an issue. Now, the Central Pacific system, at this point seems like something that would be a little bit more an obvious concern because, stuff doesn't weaken as much, like it would over land as it, does there. The Central Pacific is not going to weaken as much, even if the waters and the conditions, become a little more unfavorable. But, we see a hurricane out there, Hurricane Kiko, out there in the Pacific, the Central Pacific right now. As we're tracking things, that's definitely something to be monitoring here as we give you guys the latest. I guess maybe they're calling it the Eastern Pacific right now because I'm just checking the Hurricane Center site, but it's going to be in the Central Pacific here soon enough. It is a Central Pacific forecaster doing it, so I know it's coming up on the Eastern Pacific information. It looks like here. I know it's kind of tricky as we're tracking things because you have a designation. You'll go, from the Eastern Pacific into the Central Pacific there. But it is, Hurricane Kiko as we're looking, as we're tracking. I know, just checking some more information here. I mean, what we can kind of tell here, it was an Eastern Pacific name to start out with, so. Because Lorena's after Kiko, they've had a pretty active season, so if it would have just originated in Central Pacific, it would have been off of a different name list. But we're going to start with the Eastern Pacific name there and monitor things from that point. So let me go ahead and put on the infrared satellite. You'll be able to see what we're dealing with out here, and that is a storm system that is pretty impressive as we're tracking things. And, we're going to have to just watch it for Hawaii as we look, because as we get there toward maybe next Wednesday, it's a good ways away. Some of the models are showing to go north and south, and it's kind of hard to hit the Hawaiian Islands, directly here from a cyclone. I mean, it happened in 92 with, I believe it was Hurricane Aniki there, if I'm pronouncing that right. I just kind of, talking about that off the top here. I was, right around the time Andrew happened. As we were tracking there, that was a big deal in Hawaii because it took an angle from the south and went up. But when they come across here, especially if they're going to hit into toward the Big Island, it's going to weaken them a lot. And, generally, it's just kind of a tricky situation here. You have to have things come together just right. If you can get something, the curve back, it can be a big problem, though, like Aniki was in 92. But it was, a more powerful situation there. But as things were evolving, as things were going on, I mean, it kind of strengthened back up as it got, off toward the west. It was a unique scenario for Hawaii because a lot of times when you hit the Big Island, that's going to weaken things here. And track, is so important in trying to figure things out. So there is something to watch in the Central Pacific here that we'll continue to watch for our friends in Hawaii, or if you guys are better watching, are headed that way. I know we're talking about tsunami threat there a little over a month ago, I guess it was. Now we had that tsunami warning out there. Well, that was a big deal for those folks, wasn't it? Ultimately something that was overwhelming, but, something we had to watch, obviously. But, yeah, we're going to have to watch here Kiko, the Hurricane Center, the Central Pacific Hurricane Center. I'll be watching that as we look ahead toward the timeline. I know it is something. Last up, they had 105-mile-an-hour max sustained winds. It was a Category 2 hurricane. And I'll go ahead and pull up that Saffir-Simpson wind scale real quick. Let me go ahead and put that on the screen for everybody at home. So extensive damage would be possible from that. But again, it's expected to weaken down to a Category 1 as it gets closer to Hawaii, maybe even a tropical storm, or something, maybe, just not too powerful as it gets closer. Based on the model guidance, the TVCN is kind of the consensus. It has it coming at them, but it's a weaker tropical storm at that point based on this. But it's really far. We got to watch. I mean, how it is around here with systems in toward our area. Things can change quickly. Right now, looking like it would weaken a good bit as it got closer toward Hawaii and maybe, really weaken going over to Big Island. Not seeing a whole bunch of models going, just with a bad scenario, but it's something that you just never know. There's not a lot going on in the Atlantic. We got to watch for our friends in the Pacific there. Again, that is Hurricane Kiko as we're looking at things, as we're tracking things here. So definitely something to monitor out there toward that Central Pacific Ocean. It's way too early to know what could happen, but over a week away, maybe just over a week away from affecting those folks, with the direct impacts into Hawaii. So again, we'll just have to wait and see. We're really on the edge, because things can shift a lot. It's not even, we don't even have the cone of concern out for that area yet. Because so far out in the timeline, if this, goes one way or the other, I mean, this could be something we're watching for a good while here. I mean, with not many land areas, really hardly anything out here, it's kind of hard to put this in perspective. But this is about 1,500 miles away from the Big Island, give or take approximately. So it's still a ways away, obviously, as we're looking out there. But it is something that could become a bigger deal ultimately. It's too early to know for sure. I know you guys want the local weather. This doesn't concern us, obviously, in the Central Pacific here. So let me go to our graphics. This is your early Wednesday NAC update. This system here, well, it's something we may need to watch. But right now, the models, early indications are if this evolves maybe in the Gabrielle, it would recurve way to the east of the U.S., but, something would really shift down. Can't, just let our guard down yet. And with Aaron, we had good confidence many days out. It was kind of getting a little bit over the top. We had the rip current risk, but it was the hype on that it wasn't necessary for that we were seeing on other sources. It was obvious it was going to recurve way to the east, of Florida for sure. This one here is not obvious yet. It looks like that's going to happen. We can't rule it out yet, so just watch, but don't stress out about it. Early indications are it would recurve way east, but this is too early to rule out. Unlike Aaron, we knew pretty early on. We may know pretty early on with this, but it hadn't developed yet, so we can't rule it out yet, because sometimes the models will be developing stuff in the wrong spot. If it gets further south, then all of a sudden it can stay further south for a lot longer, and you never know. So we'll watch here. Not overly concerned. We'll have to watch, see if something develops toward the Caribbean Gulf, somewhere around there. It'd be something where, homegrown stuff or closer to homegrown stuff might be a little bit easier to get, toward our area or the southeast in this pattern, because it's a really, a favorable pattern for stuff to recurve here with that cooler air, drier try to come down, and a little bit on the early side for that. So that's good. I mean, after so many years, I think it's time. Been time for a while, but I think it'd be a good year to just not get any, U.S. hurricane landfalls here. We don't ever want them, but this definitely, we've had them so many years in a row toward even Florida after, not having any for like a decade there. We've had them just, impacts year after year after year. We may have to watch the Central Pacific. That may become a big issue even there, but and not something that, that's with Hurricane Kiko, but the Atlantic names, just have your hurricane kit up to date, obviously. But nothing to stress out about here. They're looking as we're tracking things. So that is some good news, obviously, as we're looking at all that important data. So again, trying to give you the very latest there. Just trying to keep you guys informed, obviously, on that meteorological scenario. It's just always important to kind of stay on top of things here just in case. But as we're going ahead and looking at things here, let me go ahead and kind of give you a look at our severe weather outlook across the country. So let me go ahead and jump on over here. This is going to be your severe weather outlook for that Wednesday. Severe weather outlook for your Wednesday. We do have a risk here toward Kansas City. On that Wednesday ahead, there is even a small tornado risk toward Wichita and Topeka there, Manhattan, Emporia. So we're talking about Kansas State University in here. They're zooming even tighter. You see some of these different communities. I mean, they keep zooming on in. I mean, you see there is around Wichita, and there's small tornado risk, but it's not zero. As we're looking at things, as we're tracking things. So definitely something to be mindful of, obviously, as we look here. As we track, again, small risk, not, overwhelming right now. Looking the hail risk, though, a little bit bigger. Your wind risk, even a significant hail risk here. And that is something for folks to watch as they're tracking the overall scenario out there. And I see Lawrence, Kansas. So Kansas State University watching that risk. Tornado risk maybe a little west of them, but, so that's University of Kansas and Lawrence. Manhattan's Kansas State University, obviously. So, again, we'll be kind of watching that overall meteorological storyline as we look ahead there and as we track things. I mean, there is a wind risk, though, for K-State and Manhattan and University of Kansas and Lawrence there. So we'll just have to kind of monitor all of that. So that's the national storyline for that Wednesday there. I haven't seen too many slight risks. It's been pretty calm lately. But, it's always important to, monitor things, obviously, here in the overall meteorological, meteorological outlook at things. I know on that Thursday, there's going to be a emerging risk of severe weather from about Chattanooga, Tennessee, all the way up to the Canadian border, up through New York, into Canada. So we'll have to watch that. It's not a big deal. Wind is, the primary risk for that. But we'll kind of look here, at that meteorological pattern here. It doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. So that is good, obviously. But just trying to give you guys the very latest here on what's going on, obviously, as we look at things, as we track things here. We're just trying to keep you guys up to date on everything. We're just trying to keep you guys informed. Make sure you guys understand what is happening here with the meteorological information. So again, we're just trying to be on top of everything, and make sure you guys have all that knowledge in your knowledge base here, obviously, as we look at things, as we track things here. So let me go ahead and get back on over to some other information. We'll go back to the tropics here, and you know, we still, you know, it's been nice. I mean, just cross our fingers here at this point that things stay nice in the terms of the tropics here, because you know we've had so many years. I mean, 2016 it was Hermine and Matthew. I'm just doing it off the top of my head, so I'm gonna miss some probably. But Irma in 2017, of course, Harvey in Texas in 2017. We had Michael in 2018. 2019 Dorian off the coast for around that time frame, you know. It's not being too bad for us, but it was catastrophic in the Bahamas there. And then in 2020, well, we had COVID, but we also had a lot of storms like in Louisiana with Laura and the like. We had Ida, I believe it was in 2021 in Louisiana. You know, then get to 2022, and I'm missing some, I know. It's just doing this off the top of my head. I've had so many I can't, you know, used to when I was a kid. You know, it was like Charlie, Francis, and Jean, and then, you know, you talk about Wilma, maybe the year after Katrina, of course, Dennis. It was something, you know, Ivan. There was an easier list all of a sudden. Now it's just that, you know, every year we've had this craziness out there. But I mean, you have, you know, just all those active seasons there in terms of the tropics. It's just been remarkable, and not in a good way. Not in a good way, that is for sure here. As we're looking and as we're tracking things, I mean, you know, think of that 2022 hurricane season. Of course, we had Ian that year, you know, and then 2023 is about a Dahlia, and 2024. I mean, even you had Nicole in 22 as well. Then 24, we of course had Debbie. We had, of course, then we had Helene, and then Milton. Nothing yet. 2025 really local. We had that one tropical storm toward the Carolinas. Of course, we did have that terrible situation in Texas that was indirectly, you know, caused by a remnant there, you know, the B name on the list there. It was something we weren't really, you know, expecting in terms of it being, you know, a weather player there, but ended up being an issue toward that Lone Star State there with all that terrible flooding indirectly, you know, partially, not completely because of it, partially, you know, to blame for, you know, all that rain there toward Central Texas area on July 4th. So that was a big problem there, but it wasn't a direct, you know, it was a depressing when I had Mexico, and then the little remnant spin kind of combined with, you know, just the overall pattern there and produced tragedy. But it wasn't even something that we were looking at here. I mean, hadn't had any advisories on it for days or anything that I can recall. You know, and just all of a sudden there, I mean, there was the risk of flooding, but it was something that just really became magnified at the worst possible time, right by rivers, and, you know, and just areas that are so vulnerable. But, you know, other than that, I mean, in terms of direct tropical impacts from named systems, we only had one hit the U.S. so far this year. Of course, we had rip currents from Aaron, but we only had that one there hit the U.S. this year. I'll go back and list real quick. That was Chantal, you know, right around after Barry, but Barry was the one that renamed storm. We did have that remnant issue, you know, from what was kind of sort of left over from it, you know, caused so many problems in Texas. But Adalia, of course, we just passed that 2-year anniversary here locally. Hit that early Wednesday morning. We'll never forget that, obviously, even though, you know, Helene went up to the year after last year. But it was still historic. It, you know, started off a process where a lot of homes are devastated. Some folks hadn't got back on their feet yet. Some had, and then Helene just wiped out all the progress pretty much. As you know, we keep talking about this, but these are the storms, you know, of record here for different counties across the region. I got, you know, together the data, went through everything, looking back at reports, thinking back on how the areas were impacted. You know, just really trying to, you know, I knew, you know, about many of these, you know, saw some of them here my lifetime, but, you know, some of these were before. You know, I was born here, 85, Kate. My birthday was a month before I was born there, 94, but a relative was impacted there. My late paternal grandmother had to go, like, you know, 50 miles out of the way around Albany there to get into different places because the flooding was just so bad. And, you know, that's why Alberto was on here. It's kind of bizarre. I mean, the only tropical storm on this list is storm of record. I mean, it was worse than Michael. even though Michael was pretty bad for Doherty, Lee counties there. I mean, the wind damage, some backyard had it worse, but it's subjective here, and for the overall region, the flooding, I would say is a bigger story, towards some of those areas than the wind even though some areas obviously, some areas are going to get it worse from one storm than another. Some folks, including myself, I wasn't around during Dora in '64, but this is just kind of that benchmark storm my mother was. She was riding it out there at, I believe it's the old, not the one that's closed, here in the last few years, but the old Hampton Elementary before that. They're back in '64 as a, pretty young person there. Something that she'll never forget. So, again, this is something to keep you guys, updated on in terms of these. We hope we don't have to change these for a long time, to be quite honest, because if we do, that means we've got another storm here to be a big problem as we're looking and as we're tracking things. So, again, very important to just kind of keep in mind here, as we're looking at the overall situation. I mean, you see Helene there, obviously. I mean, we can't, overstate how bad that was, even though, our fatality numbers here locally weren't just off the charts, even though we did, have some during Helene. It was terrible. One is one too many. I mean, they were off the charts in Western North Carolina, though, and it's a weird thing because it hit here. It was very, very bad here, and somehow yet, Western North Carolina was by far the hardest hit area from Helene because of all that precip. They had a rain event preceding things here, out ahead on the fringe of it, and then when it came in, it was just so much rain so quick in the mountain areas out there, and it caused, this catastrophic damage in Western North Carolina. Of course, Irma, that's one I remember well, in my lifetime, going back here. Irma is definitely the worst storm we had in Bradford in the last 3 decades. But this is going back to 1950, and Dora definitely would be the top mark there. Irma wasn't that far off of Dora in a way for Bradford. I mean, you see a lot to a myriad our Irma, but Dora was worse there, looking at the different stats. I mean, it was the direct, hurricane hit. It was still a hurricane with the center of it coming across Bradford County. So, you got to take that into effect. I mean, it's unbelievable. Cross our fingers, even though how unlucky some of our areas been, or even all of our area have at least, fringe impacts. We have not had, something like Dora since Dora, obviously. That was the only, and it's still since, 1900 here. So we're talking about the 20th century, the 21st century, Dora. And let me think I'm doing that right. Yeah, 20th century, 21st century. As we're tracking things here, but in those time frames, which we're still continuing obviously now, as we're kind of looking, as we're giving you guys the updates here. I know it's a situation where Dora, going here last 125 years or so, that's the only storm, of hurricane strength to make that a direct northeast Florida landfall. We've not had any hurricanes hit from the Atlantic, northeast Florida there as a hurricane. It's only northeast Florida Atlantic hurricane landfall, 1900s, and since 2000 as well, was Dora in '64. Now 1898 it was southeast Georgia, is where some areas got it the hardest really. That was a catastrophic hurricane back then. That was worse than Dora for like Camden, Glen, Nassau, for sure. I mean, that was, we had like, 15 feet of surge, something like that in some of those areas in 1898. So areas, like around Jacksonville, southeast Georgia, Helene was bad, and where's, was bad, and where in Pearson, Brantley, and a landfall system in the east could still be worse for sure, but Camden, Glen, Nassau, Duval, St. John's, even Flagler. I mean, all these areas are overdue. If you had a hurricane from the east, it takes a lot of bad things to happen, to get one to just curve left, because, you have the way the meteorological patterns work, it's a lot easier for a system to go from south to north than it is from east to west here, really, at this point here on the globe. But still, it's something that can happen. When it does, like in '64 with Dora, it's not good. I mean, Dora was really bad, but even like I said, 1898 was worse. we had a Hurricane Cedar Key before, 1900 as well. That was really bad. That was just devastating for Bradford County. So there can still be worse storylines than what we, really seen here, here in these last, preceding decades. Even though I would say, as they're looking, Helene was something, about almost as bad as they can get for, Horseshoe Beach there, some of those other beaches around there. I mean, just, it was awful. I mean, we already had, 23 Adalia, thought about as bad as it could get. And then somehow Helene just went up in every spot here and even added to some ground where it became the worst hurricane, in many, many decades. Kate and E5, I mean, it's remarkable. I mean, if you would have shown me this year, I mean, we've had so many hurricanes for Tallahassee and around. If I would have seen this graphic here, I'd have had multiple hurricanes in the last decade. I'd have said, if I'd have had this together then, I'd have said, well, Kate's probably not going to be the storm of record anymore after, like, if Michael went a little east, or Adalia went a little west, Helene went a little west, even Hermine, a little bit stronger. Word track was pretty bad for Leon. But if it had just been a little stronger, it would have been a storm of record in Leon instead of Kate. It was bad. Hermine was bad for folks. It was a wake-up call, quite honestly, for a lot of folks there, because there was power out for a while because all those trees they have there in Leon just falling on down. And then, then you have Michael, then you have Adalia, you have Helene, you had others. You had little tropical systems like Mindy there, I remember, coming right through Tallahassee. And, it wasn't that terrible, but it's still impactful to some degree. We had Debbie in the east, we had Debbie 2012, we've had there's so many. I mean, we could go on all night about this. It's crazy to talk about Levy County 1950. There, obviously, Hurricane Easy. That was worse though, based on everything I've read, than Helene or Dahlia there. Even though those were both bad, the surge numbers, well, and people on the coast, it might have been something where those were more impactful. But we had like maybe 50 inches or so of rain based on what I've read, parts of Levy County during Easy, because it kept looping around. Looping around one time into Levy County, just that's not good when you have one looping around. It's kind of like Hurricane Harvey for Levy County was Hurricane Easy. Now they got in Houston during Harvey. That's kind of what Levy County got during Easy in 1950. Obviously not near as much concrete, so it's not going to have as much of an impact, but still very, very impactful. So again, there's just so much to unpack on this graphic here. I mean, Matthew 2016 there. Something where, if a little bit further west, we would have probably had St. John's, Duval, Nassau get changed here, maybe Camden, England as well, to Matthew. Luckily, that didn't happen. It was close enough to Flagler and the way Dora was, with the northern side being stronger, the way the waters pushes in. Matthew was worse than Dora and Flagler in 16, Matthew 16 versus Dora in 64, but other than that, I mean, it could have been way worse. Matthew's still bad for those areas, but if this would have been a little bit further west, Matthew could have been something that was a storm of record here, since 1950 for St. John's, Duval, Nassau, Camden. There were really grave concerns, but luckily they didn't pan out here. If that, Matthew would have just been just a little bit further west, it was kind of going to, if it just goes a little bit further one way or the other, that changes everything, as you can see here. But again, let me go ahead and see our next 7 days in terms of rain. And, there's some areas that have had 2 or 3 really bad storms, others not so much. So that graphic is very important, but, it doesn't still, even though it tells a lot, it doesn't tell that full story, that, name history graphic there of the storms of record. But your next 7 days rainfall wise, you see quite a bit of rain towards South Florida there. I know those folks down there are really excited about that Miami Hurricanes football team. They were really impressive in Notre Dame. Notre Dame, new quarterback for them. I mean, young quarterback compared to the transfer for Miami, but I mean, they're still impressive as well. You can go to clutter.com/radar for an interactive look at things. I know North Florida here seeing lesser rainfall over the next week, quarter, half inch, but it starts to get more and more as you get further down toward the south. I mean, see the first coast to the east, maybe closer to an inch. But as you get down toward Orlando and Lakeland and Fort Myers and West Palm, it gets higher and higher where it could come maybe a flood event for folks in towards South Florida. They do need some rain down there. They've had some drought concerns, so if you get too much too quick, that can become an issue. But they do need the rain down there. So that's where we've really had some drought concerns in the state. So, not the worst thing ever to have some of that precip down there, I would say, just from this perspective. You don't want to have too much too quick, because then that can be a big problem. But as you go ahead and look at my college football playoff rankings here, so it's kind of interesting because, you can look at this and, well, like I took South Carolina out of my teams for, consideration right now because they won against Virginia Tech, but it wasn't all that impressive. And there's been a lot of other impressive performances. There's been a lot going on here in college football, and quite honestly, this doesn't even tell the whole story either, because you can go on and things are going to change. So I have Penn State number 1. I know a lot of people want to put Ohio State number 1. That's where they were on the AP poll. They came out on Tuesday. I mean, they were, kind of lackluster there. They barely beat Texas. Texas is really good, based on what we were expecting. They were number 1 to start out. They didn't drop as far. I dropped them to 9. They dropped to 7 in the AP, I believe it was. And, I don't know. Ohio State could have maybe sort of won by more. It's just a tricky thing. So, I have Penn State number 1, Ohio State number 2, because no longer do the top 4 teams have to be in the actual bracket conference champs. And quite honestly, whether it's something we want to see or not, I mean, in some weeks it'll probably match up differently. Because this is, some of these are pretty big departure from the rankings compared to what I generally would have. I mean, as I always really do with this graphic, I do it before the actual rankings come out, and it's so early. There's so many undefeated teams or teams that just, had that, big game and they lost by a little. It's kind of hard to move these around, but it'd be great if an ACC Big 12 champ, both of those could get into that top 4. They get that bye, but right now I just don't have that happening. It might happen. I mean, it is something there to see, though. Miami, Georgia, USF in the playoff based on my projections of FSU, Florida, and Georgia Tech, all, not that far out. That's something we don't see really. All these local-ish teams, or local in case of Florida and FSU, be, in the, consideration for the college football playoff. Keep things interesting, but we do have to keep in mind this week Florida plays USF. Soon it's going to be Florida, Miami, USF, Miami, FSU, Miami in early October, UF and FSU in late November. So some of these spots, you don't have to be undefeated anymore to get into the playoffs or one loss, because of the way it's not 12 teams. But of course, in FSU's case, they were undefeated in 23 and it didn't matter. But anyway, Iowa State here, the Big 12 champ, is where I have, them is the number 6 spot. And then you have Oregon there at number 7. I mean, so ACC champ at 5, Iowa State at 6 there, the Big 12 champ. Both of those are just, out of the buys, but they do get home games. It's, be something if FSU gets in, quite honestly, it'd be really nice for FSU to get a home game you might want to buy. But, after everything we've had, I don't think you'd really, if you're like 5 or 6, 7, or 8, you'll get that home game. I mean, it kind of depends. I mean, if you're close to getting a bye, maybe you want that. It just depends on how it sets up, because some years one spot's going to be a lot more favorable than others. I mean, last year, I believe it was 7 versus 8 for the title. So they got the home games, they got the first round games. It was a little bit different. This year's different. So with the way they took out, it didn't have to be conference champs anymore for the top 4. Granted, some will, and, Big 10 and SEC are, because they think the schedule, whether we like it or not, the way they play each other is probably going to get them a little higher, and it's going to be something, right now, I mean, this is what I look at and see, what I would think, is what I would put them at, but I might put them at something later on that's different, but then the committee will say, well, the ACC and Big 12 are weaker. Even if I move some of them up, then they're going to move them down. It could get kind of, tricky, as it always does. I've Clemson a little lower than some people. That was really a disappointing performance at home, only scoring a handful of points against LSU. I moved LSU way up. Their quarterback looked sharp, but neither team played as good as they could, really. And then Notre Dame there. I mean, that was an impressive performance with the new quarterback. They almost beat Miami on the road there. I didn't really dock them too much for that. Texas, I mean, again, they were not that impressive. Clemson was not that impressive at all. Most people would not put TCU in here over Iowa State. They put Arizona State, but I think Arizona State has some issues, because just like Boise State, who lost by a lot to USF, Arizona State doesn't have their good running back anymore. So I've taken them out for now. Granted, they're going to play at Mississippi State this weekend, so we'll find out about them. Illinois, they're just out. They're going to play, I believe, Duke this weekend, if I recall. And then Georgia Tech, they're a team that I've been, having just on the fringes. Some folks have them a little bit further out. I did add UF to this graphic because I have a feeling, UF, should be able to win that game against USF this weekend. And depending on if it's a really close one, I might keep USF in there and then bump Florida like 11. We'll see. But if it's like a big blowout, then maybe Florida goes up a little higher, and then you put Tulane back in for that group of 5, group of 6, whatever you want to call it, non-power slot. Champ number 5, technically it doesn't have to be that, but that's how it's generally been. Boise last year to get the bye, so it was ACC in the champ number 5 slot. But you get the idea as we're tracking things. That seem to be a little less likely to play out year to year the way it did. Last year played out a little different, but there's kind of a look at things as we're tracking them, as we're giving you guys everything you need to know about that. Of course, the weather, FSU game, Florida game, looks decent this weekend. A little warm, though, so that's something to take into consideration. Rain chances is lower, but they're not 0, so don't let your guard down, obviously, as we're looking and as we're tracking things there. Rain chances are not 0 for the weekend here, but lower for sure than they were last week. We got lucky. For much of that, FSU game did have some rain, but some folks, I think, liked it. We didn't have the lightning, so we still have to watch out. It's going to be kind of warm, though, especially for that noon kickoff in Tallahassee. That's always a concern. Noon kickoffs in September can be an issue here for heat exhaustion and heat stroke for folks. So making sure drinking plenty of water will be key. I know. If we get some more clouds, that would help, but we don't want the storms. Lower chance of that means maybe some more heat. That'd be something to, be monitoring here, obviously. The Jaguars, obviously, is the NFL. I know, speaking of TCU, North Carolina, some people were calling them an NFL team. Well, it didn't go so well against TCU Monday night. I was really impressed there by the quarterback for the Horned Frogs, and, Roy, that conference is one where, so it kind of switches around who the top team is. They were a few years ago the top team in that conference, made it all the way to the championship. Didn't end so well there against Georgia, but you get the idea. They, were pretty good there. But in the Jaguars on that Sunday, the weather storm teams have started to go up a little bit more, but they have a 1 o'clock kick against Carolina out of the NFL, and then it'd be something where they have to be, watching the weather just a little bit more, 40% chance for that, versus like 30% for a Saturday. And it could be still a little warm, so have to watch out. The 1 o'clock kicks, noon kicks this time of year, you always have to watch. If you're not going to have the rain and the lightning, if it's not overcast, you're not worried about storms, you're probably worried about the heat a little bit more, and that could become an issue for folks here, not, being used to being out in that for 3 or 4 hours, 5, 6 hours, depending on if you had the tailgate time, the getting in time, leaving time. So got to be careful there. There's your forecast, your extended outlook here next 7 days. 10% chance of rain on that Wednesday. It goes up to, that's a lot lower than what we had last week, because we ended up getting some of that cool air to work in, which was nice, and drier air, some clouds. It was nice Labor Day around here. Yard work and the like here around Stark, at least. We're down to 64 right now here east of Stark, though, on my thermometer, rural area. 67 is a good, number to kind of tell folks about for the region now, because the beaches, which are going to be warmer, obviously. Now, this, cooler than what I had, but then we started to warm up during the day. The dry air, we started to have, warmer air, though, start to come in a way, even if it, is something where, it is kind of cooler at the night. When you have the drier air here, it is warmer still when, during the days, you have that sunshine out there, and you start to add a little bit of moisture here and there, and then eventually you add moisture enough to get higher rain chances. Early next week, you could have quite a few storms around again, 60% there. That may be a little aggressive. I put it in there over Monday and Tuesday because some of us on a good bit of rain, some are not. I thought about going with this 50 there, but I wanted to kind of, indicate how, things are going to go up here. And with these type of temperatures, eventually you're going to have to bump them even lower with some type of frontal boundary again. Because that's still, we're below average for this morning, which is nice, and even tomorrow morning here, next morning as well. But, eventually these highs are going to go down. I mean, 94 is above average for Saturday. That's kind of concerning for those football games, obviously for some folks, it's a dry heat. It's still hot. Still can cause problems. 93 Sunday. So have to watch out for the heat some. And then you start to see, again, more moisture around. Eventually we can, have to have big sips in the pattern with moisture generally, not always, but generally along boundaries to cool us off or try to get cooler some, or we have tropical systems to balance things out, and you don't want that either, that type of low come in, but that's always possible. Not that we're seeing that right now or anything in our extended look, but again, you have to have that in general, so just always important to kind of watch things here. Those rain chances going back up again. So just, whenever thunder roars, go indoors. But yeah, for Saturday, Sunday, 93 for that Jaguar game in the afternoon. It's pretty warm as well. So just have to be mindful of that, obviously. It's going to be toasty as we're tracking things. So I think that pretty much covered everything for tonight, though. Let me see if there's any questions or comments from any of the viewers at home. I'll go ahead and check here. See if there's anything. See anything. I know it's pretty late, but I appreciate you guys tuning in, trusting me. Have a great night. We'll be back late Thursday with another full report, unless we need to come back earlier. I just try to enjoy things. It is, pretty nice weather. I mean, I don't want to paint this as some type of a gloomy thing, because, we don't have a tropical system. We don't have, big threats like severe weather. We had that weird pop-up tornado warning situation back late last week on that Thursday, but not that we're expecting anything like that here, but that wasn't really something we were seeing in the forecast too much either. But, this is nice weather. I mean, it was nice during that Labor Day, really, compared to what we've been seeing. It's going to get, a little on the warmer side, though, when people are outside on that Saturday. That's unfortunate, but, not too many storms. But, yeah, be drinking plenty of water there. I know some folks, maybe it doesn't, depending on where you're at. In some of the games, they let you get water. Some games, you have to pay quite a bit for it. I don't know exactly, which ones. I know some places are a lot more open to letting you bring water in. Some aren't, but yeah, you got to be making sure somehow you're getting that water, staying hydrated, even if it's not a really humid heat. It still be pretty humid. I mean, it's still early September. It's not as humid. Especially like, earlier on, but some of those games, yeah, the humidity is going to start kind of catching back up with us some. So you got to keep that in mind here as we're tracking things. It isn't, like October or November yet, that is for sure. I know we're watching those, tidal flood conditions, toward the coast areas or the northeasterly winds. That's been a concern that we're watching, as we're tracking things. So. But yeah, as we look toward that Sunday there, I mean, those heat index values, they'll still be up there. I mean, we're, even if it's not, the worst heat you've ever had, I mean, we're talking about there, that 7th of the month. We're still talking about heat index value there in the mid to upper 90s. So even if it is in the 80s there, in Jacksonville for their temperature, that's still hot. Like Saturday there, that FSU game, be a little bit worse probably because of where that is at there. Your air temperature won't be as cool. So that's just kind of, be watching that there, obviously, as we track things here. I mean, heat index forecast, few notches higher, closer to about 100 according to the service in Tallahassee for Saturday during that game. So yeah, even if the humidity, isn't something that is as high as it's been, it's still going to be an issue. Even, and the rain chance is pretty low for that. I mean, they have, even lesser than I do for that Tallahassee area during the game on that Saturday. So yeah, it's going to be more about drinking that water there as we look ahead in toward the timeline. So, the wind not going to be blowing too much probably for that right now. So that could be an issue toward Tallahassee with folks. But we need to drink that water here. Again, I don't want to be, gloomy about it. I mean, we could have a hurricane coming. We don't, we've seen that in the last several years. But still, folks do have to be careful. We still have to be, watching out for all the different hazards, even though your chance to be all right. But if you're not taking precautions, then there could always be an issue. And, just you gotta be careful, as we're tracking things. Again, nothing really impactful, on a wide scale, but, that heat, that storms, storm threat more holding off to most of the games probably. As we're seeing things, but that heat threat here could be a sneaky one because it wasn't as hot last week for some of those games. This weekend, both of the local college games are there in the afternoon. It was a little bit later and cool with the rain for the FSU one, and then the Florida one was at night. This time around, they're both in the afternoon, one early, one 4 o'clock or so. So FSU is really concerning because that's the peak heating, but Florida's still concerning. Not even any clouds around, not maybe a good breeze out there either, and then it gets to become a problem with the heat exhaust and heat stroke here. It could be kind of a tricky thing. We hear about it every year, pretty much these games. Jaguar game could be somewhat of an issue as well on that Sunday. People kind of take things a little bit maybe for granted here in terms of, well, it's just something where it was not last week. I'll be all right, but then you be out in that heat for a while and it starts to become an issue. And it's not something I would I look at this, I see 94, that sticks out, but it's not 100. So I'm saying, well, I'm not, it's not something that's just is really overwhelming. Like not having a storm chance, but then you have the heat chance. In terms of it becoming a problem for people in the vulnerable groups, especially elderly folks, young children, folks with medical conditions. You have to be mindful of that. So that's something to watch for. With the heat threat for those games there, we want folks to be drinking plenty of water, stay hydrated, wear light colored, loose fitting clothing if you can there for those games on Saturday and Sunday. Friday night high school football, obviously you're, losing that sunshine, so still be careful with that, but it shouldn't be as big of an issue. Obviously some players could have cramps and the like, but, it still could be an issue for a few folks, I think you could say, but it's not the same as being in that peak heating with that sun bearing down. You might want to wear a hat, something like that there, or that sunscreen. We're kind of, I haven't been talking about that as much here because we had the rain chances higher, but the game times kind of indicate, well, I remember being at FSU years ago, at this point, it's been a good while, but I remember reading one of my meteorological textbooks there, just starting out, this intro class there, and reading about, well, wait a minute, that UV index is right, reading about the, sunshine there being that issue, and right before a football game, I think it's like my first one there, I gotta put that sunscreen on because I'm gonna get burnt, and that's something you just always gotta remember to do here, because otherwise you're gonna have those spots there that kind of stand out. Sometimes you miss a spot, and that's an issue too, but you just want to make sure you're wearing that sunscreen here, drinking plenty of water, and just being vigilant here with that heat, because some folks, it looked pretty nice out there watching on TV from last week at FSU, but this week, I know we had the rain, but, this time that heat could kind of toast people in a way, so we got to be extra careful about that. 1 week it's one thing, 1 week it's another, but if you're just being mindful, and really being aware of things, you should be all right. So that's a lot to say, there about something that's probably not going to affect a whole bunch, assuming you're taking the proper precautions. But it's important to let people know about the threats. Have a great night, everybody. Stay safe.